Welcome, this is Brianne Lowe, State Biologist with the USD NRCS Indiana. This is Module 3 of a 6-part series on the use of Indiana's Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. Modules covering varying cover types, one-man counter when evaluating and planning wildlife habitat in Indiana are available. If you have not viewed Module 1, Overview of the WHEG, I encourage you to start there prior to diving into the land cover modules. Module 2, the Cropland WHEG, will also dive into the rapid assessment model available in the WHEG tool. In this module, we will focus on existing crop field that does have existing vegetation along its border. The landowner is interested in a quail border along the north edge of the property where there is brushy overgrowth and along the wooded edge to the east where the cropland production is low. Upon review on site, brushy habitat is primarily bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose. During the field visit, you will determine, based on the landowner goals and the site conditions, whether or not to use the associated ag wood dominated or the associated ag grass dominated. Because the site is primarily dominated by invasive species and based on the landowner goals, the shrubby and wooded habitat that is present will be removed to remove that invasive species component and herbaceous habitat planted approximately 40 foot wide on both this northern existing edge and along the eastern boundary. 3 acres will be planted on the north edge and 3.5 acres along the east for a total of 6.5 acres. This is a case where you could either lump or split these two new habitat types out, but based on the similar habitat on the site and similar cover that will be present at the end, these will be lumped together in this example. This is also a good time and place to discuss the impact of adding some brush to the habitat to provide cover for quail and other species. As long as the woody habitat at the end goal will be less than 25%, the herbaceous grassland habitat WHEG can be used. So let's dive into the WHEG itself. Because the landowner is primarily looking at planting the herbaceous habitat, we will be using the habitat grassland dominated WHEG. In this case, we were looking at what is present on site, and there is a small amount of habitat already existing on the site with the existing brushy habitat. And although we will be removing a lot of the cover on this habitat, it is present on site and should be accounted for in the benchmark condition. In this case, while that end amount will be 3 acres, that northern portion has about an acre of existing habitat on it. As mentioned during the summary, the planned habitat, when adding all of the herbaceous habitat out there, will be about 6.5 acres, so reaches this category C of at least 5 acres. So there is an increase in the overall habitat out there. The current width is just around 30 feet with the existing brushy habitat that is out there. But we will be adding 40 feet, which doesn't really increase overall. So actually that score will remain the same. And that's just one of those examples where there's not a big enough jump or change in that habitat overall to change that width. The current plant composition on site is primarily invasive species in that shrubby cover. So we would be looking at a score of 0. Of course, we plan to get rid of those invasive species and plant native species on site, so we will be jumping that score to a 1. The vegetative species richness right now being it is primarily those invasive species. Any grasses that are out there are most likely going to be some of the more invasive fescues or bromes. So we'll start with a vegetative richness score of 0. In this case, the landowner is looking just to plant the minimum to meet the standard of the 2 graminoids and 5 additional species of grasses. So that will jump to that minimum criteria of 0.5. And of course, although we have no legumes out there now, our standard requires the inclusion of a perennial legume, and so that will be included on site. As most of this habitat will be going into the cropland setting, and we will be controlling the invasive species present on the site, we do begin with that bare ground setting for most of the habitat that is out there. And then we will jump up, as stated in the instructions here under the vegetation management, up to that score of 0.5 planned condition. At this time, the landowner has no pesticide-free setback, and if a 25-foot setback went into a 40-foot buffer, it would cover more than 50%. So there will not be greater than 50% of the area protected from that pesticide setback. So in this case, it actually remains at a 0. At this time, the coverage of invasive species on the site is pretty high. And this is where we can look at it as right now, that habitat is 100% invasive species. You can also look at it that the habitat that is planned in the end, that 6%, the 6 acres that will be covered in that footprint, a portion of that is invasive species. What we know is it's definitely more than that 10% threshold. And so use your best judgment on where you think this is going to end up. In this case, we're in that 21 to 50% cover, looking at what's out there, so we'll go with that 0. But the landowner intends to control it, so our intent at that point would be to get it to less than 10% coverage. So we will get it to at least the 0.5. If you believe the landowner can control it completely on site, you can give a score of 1. This is a chance to look at the surrounding conditions, see how likely it is for the invasive species to reinvade quickly, what the landowner's intent for the management is. The landowner must keep that, if this is a CRP habitat, below the 10%. So we'll go with that 0.5, which is the threshold. In structures for wildlife, at this time, there are no structures out there. As I said, the brushy habitat is almost entirely the invasive shrubs. If there was a snag out there, if with potential cavities in it, if there were some raptor perches out there, if you were incorporating escape cover, those are things to consider when looking at the benchmark and planned score. Of course, we will be using bunch grasses, so although there's not anything out there now necessarily, or we're going to be removing what's out there now, we will end up with at least some cover on site. If the landowner again wanted to add some shrubs to that component after they remove the invasive species, you could bump this up to 2 and it would be a 0.5. So looking at these scores, as we scroll down to the primary habitat suitability index here, we can once again see the benchmark score is a 0.08. So that is clearly in the poor category, but we jump that score up to a 0.6, which would definitely get it into a solid good category for the site. We can then take some time to look at the landscape factors. Again, we were looking at what is the species diversity that's on site. Right now, it's relatively poor because it's primarily the invasive shrubby cover. The landowner has no intent of leaving a food plot or standing, so we're going to leave both of these at a 0. This landowner uses cover crops on an annual basis already. So we will add that score in. There will be no change into the future. This is a no-till system. And no IPM. By coming down now to look at these scores, we can see that the benchmark primary PHSI or primary habitat suitability index score was a poor, as we would anticipate. The landscape habitat suitability index was also at a poor, but based on the practices that will be installed, which are that minimum habitat planting criteria that we have of 2 grasses, 5 graminoids, including, or 5 forbs, including a perennial legume, and then some of the landscape factors that are going on out there, we go from that poor benchmark condition to a good condition that brings the site into the to meet planning criteria. And obviously that planning habitat score improved. So therefore this project would be eligible for financial assistance, whether through CRP or EQIP. And it shows as well that that habitat will overall improve for wildlife. That concludes our review of existing cover next to our crop field. We will take a look at existing cover on site in our next module.